Battle of the Bulge, fought during the winter of 1944 and 45, was the most bitter battle of the entire Northwest European campaign. After the Allies broke out from Normandy and liberated France, supply lines became overstretched, slowing their advance. This gave Hitler an opportunity to strike back. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the Germans attacked in the Belgian Ardennes region. The events that followed revealed major blunders by the top German and Allied commanders. U.S. Generals Eisenhower and Bradley and British Field Marshal Montgomery ignored information from their own intelligence staff that the Germans were preparing a massive operation and that it would take place in the Ardennes. They were totally surprised by the German onslaught. As for the Germans, Hitler's grandiose plan was ill-conceived. His plan to push for the North Sea coast was too ambitious, given the Allied superiority in men and weapons. Hitler also relied too heavily on foggy weather to neutralize Allied air power. And with the German army short on fuel, he gambled on capturing fuel from his enemies. Finally, Hitler refused to accept that in the winter, the hilly and wooded Ardennes was unsuitable for launching a blitzkrieg-style attack. The German offensive failed. They succeeded in upsetting Allied plans and delayed their advance to the River Rhine by some 6 weeks, but it cost the Germans far more. They suffered some 80,000 casualties, which they could not afford at this point in the war. But even worse, Hitler concentrated his forces in the west. He should have given priority to the Eastern Front, where the Russians were preparing to mount a major assault to penetrate the German heartland. When the Allies broke out of Normandy at the end of July 1944, it seemed as though they had broken the back of the German army in the west. The Allies quickly liberated most of France. The odds appeared to favor a final victory in Europe before the end of 1944. But overstretched supply lines slowed the Allied advance. By the middle of September, the advance came to a virtual halt. Hitler began to draw up plans for a counteroffensive. He was convinced that if he could physically split the British 21st Army Group from the U.S. 12th Army Group, punching through and capturing the port of Antwerp, he could put the Allies on the defensive. But Hitler recognized the Allies' overwhelming air superiority, so his offensive was scheduled for winter, when frequent fog would cloak his forces and restrict Allied air operations. Fog would also help the Germans gain an element of surprise, essential to the success of any attack. Hitler ordered General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff at Supreme Headquarters, to draw up a detailed plan for the German counteroffensive. Jodl concluded that the most suitable sector for the attack was the Ardennes. In May of 1940, the Ardennes was where the Germans had surprised the French and British by sending the bulk of their panzers through its wooded hills. But the Germans would discover that winter in the Ardennes was very different than spring. The German objective remained the Belgian port of Antwerp. The main attack would be conducted by 2 armies. One was Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. The other was Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, which was largely composed of Waffen-SS armored divisions. Hitler selected November 25, 1944, as the date for the attack. But for secrecy's sake, no one outside Hitler's headquarters was told about the plan until October 22nd. First to be told was the German commander-in-chief in the West, Gerd von Rundstedt. He was horrified by the concept of the operation. So was his subordinate in charge of Army Group B, Walter Model. Because of Allied successes, both men believed Antwerp was far too ambitious an objective, and beyond the powers of the German forces. The Allies had maintained a sustained air offensive against German oil facilities and transportation. As a result, the panzers did not have enough fuel to reach Antwerp. But unlike his generals, Hitler was willing to gamble that his troops would seize Allied fuel during their advance. Von Rundstedt and Model disagreed, believing that this alone would jeopardize the operation. They immediately drew up a more modest plan. Instead of pushing to Antwerp, they proposed a double envelopment of the American forces around Aachen. Hitler refused to listen. All he would concede was pushing back the date to allow more time for preparation. A high level of secrecy was maintained. Only gradually were subordinate commanders made aware of the plan. Deployment of German troops and vehicles took place by night. By day, they waited in woods and villages. Strict radio silence was maintained. But these careful preparations could not offset the basic flaws in Hitler's plan. On the Allied side, General Omar Bradley's U.S. 12th Army Group was responsible for the Ardennes sector, covered by his 1st Army. In early December 1944, the area was quiet with little activity. The wintry terrain discouraged offensive operations. Only 4 infantry divisions defended an 80-mile front with 1 armored division in reserve. 2 infantry divisions were recovering from bitter fighting in the Hürtgen forest to the north. The other 2 infantry divisions had only recently arrived in Europe. They were sent to the Ardennes to acclimate to combat conditions without risking significant casualties. Allied intelligence information reinforced the belief that the Germans would not attempt an offensive action in the Ardennes. An earlier spell of autumn fog had hindered Allied air reconnaissance. It was not able to gain much information on German intentions, and an assumption was made that they would remain on the defensive. Nevertheless, U.S. intelligence did obtain some indication of an impending German attack. First, although all German deployments were made at night, the sound of German tank engines carried a long way. American troops in forward positions in the Ardennes heard them and reported back. Second, due to tight radio security, Ultra, the Allied ability to crack top-secret messages sent via the German Enigma coding machine, was able to obtain little information. But it did intercept one crucial message. It was from an air liaison officer attached to the 6th Panzer Army. It referred to the coming big operation, significant not just because it confirmed that the Germans were planning something, but because Allied intelligence had been trying to locate the 6th Panzer Army since autumn. Finally, the German-imposed radio silence of their attack forces in the Ardennes should have indicated to Allied intelligence they were up to something. Allied High Command ignored these indicators. Eisenhower and his subordinate American commanders committed a grave blunder by convincing themselves that Germany was no longer capable of a major offensive after its huge losses in Normandy and the Allied liberation of France. Sir Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, thought the same. The Allies, especially the Americans, were in for a terrible shock. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the beginning of the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes caught the Americans by surprise. The preliminary artillery barrage effectively cut American telephone lines and disrupted supply routes behind the front lines. This added to the confusion of the U.S. troops. German battle groups quickly sliced through the American forward positions. U.S. convoys were ambushed and totally destroyed. Just as Hitler planned, thick fog grounded the Allied Air Force. German panzers spearheading the attack were soon deep behind the American lines. Increasing numbers of shocked American soldiers were taken prisoner. During the first hours of the attack, Omar Bradley, whose headquarters were well to the rear, could not believe the German onslaught was a full-blown offensive. Based on the scant information he received, he thought it was just a local counterattack. The decimation of his frontline units soon made Bradley realize the Allies had seriously misjudged the situation in the Ardennes. The Allies were also confused by Germans who infiltrated the lines, dressed in U.S. uniforms and driving captured American vehicles. They carried out acts of sabotage, altering signposts and cutting telephone cables. The chaos they created was so great that Eisenhower was confined to his headquarters based on the fear of a possible assassination attempt. Like Omar Bradley, Eisenhower was also forced to acknowledge that he had completely misread the German situation. By now, the Panzer spearheads were closing on the River Meuse. If they could cross it quickly, Antwerp was within their grasp. But the Germans were also beginning to realize that they too had blundered. Hitler's gamble was not paying off. The Battle of the Bulge was about to turn against him. By the third day of the 1944 Ardennes offensive, the Germans had penetrated up to 20 miles behind Allied lines. But the winding, narrow lanes of the hilly Ardennes were not as easy to navigate as they had been in May 1940. Mud and snow slowed the armored battle groups. They were also running out of fuel. The Americans had destroyed gasoline stores in the path of the panzers, denying the Germans more fuel. This destroyed one of the cornerstones of Hitler's plan. Some panzers were forced to halt because their tanks ran dry. Others were lost when they slid off the slick roads. In the north, Zepp Diedrich's problems were aggravated by an additional factor. An enterprising U.S. engineering battalion blew up a number of key bridges in his sector, which slowed his advance. In the south, Hasso von Manteuffel faced a different problem. His part of the plan called for the capture of the small Belgian town of Bastogne. It stood at the junction of several important roads. The town was defended by elements of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The division resisted every German attempt to secure the town. At one point, McAuliffe responded to the German demand that he surrender with a single word: nuts. As long as Bastogne held out, von Manteuffel would have serious problems with his logistics. 9 German divisions were eventually committed to the capture of Bastogne, but it continued to hold out. Hitler now lost his gamble on the weather. On the 22nd of December, the 7th day of the offensive, the fog cleared. The Allied air forces came into action, causing massive destruction to all the German forces. Hitler's troops now paid dearly for his Ardennes plan. In contrast, the Allies recovered from the effects of their earlier blunder in misreading the German intent to attack. They now took full control of the battle. Ultra now informed Eisenhower that the River Meuse was the German initial objective before Antwerp. Montgomery took responsibility for the northern part of the Bulge and deployed his troops to this sector. Bradley retained control over the southern half of the Bulge. Both commanders were to make sure the German advance was stopped before it reached the Meuse. Terrain difficulties and a fuel shortage forced Zepp Dietrich's panzers to grind to a halt in the hills of the Eifel. But despite problems at Bastogne, Hasse von Manteuffel was still advancing. Eisenhower ordered George Patton's 3rd U.S. Army to halt its eastward operation, swing around 90 degrees, and strike the southern flank of the 5th Panzer Army. Patton had already begun preparing for this and quickly began advancing northward against the Germans. Patton's threat to cut off von Manteuffel's spearhead forced the German 5th Army to halt its advance short of the River Meuse. Frustrated by Allied air operations, the Germans resorted to an act of suicidal desperation on New Year's Day, 1945. They launched air attacks against Allied airfields in the hope of destroying a maximum number of aircraft. The Luftwaffe's 300 planes had little effect on the massive Allied air forces. A comparable number of German and Allied aircraft were shot down. But German losses were much more serious. Among the Luftwaffe fighter pilots killed were some of the most experienced. They would be sorely missed during the final desperate months to come. By mid-January 1945, the Allies had driven the Germans back to where they started. Hitler had blundered in thinking he could reach Antwerp in midwinter with a force short of fuel and lacking any form of air superiority. Moreover, the men, tanks, and guns lost in his abortive Ardennes counteroffensive could have been put to much better use. They could have been used to further delay the Allied advance on Germany's last natural obstacle in the west, the River Rhine. Although the German resistance was bitter, they could not halt the Allies, who successfully crossed the river well before the end of March and swiftly advanced into the German heartland. The German forces used in the Ardennes could have also been deployed to the Eastern Front, where the Red Army, static in Poland, was preparing for another major attack. It was mounted on January 12, 1945, across the river Vistula. From this point on, the Russians proved unstoppable. First, they raced to the River Oder, Germany's natural barrier in the east. Then, they took the German capital itself. But the loss of men and materiel in the abortive Battle of the Bulge meant that Hitler was powerless to prevent the crushing of his Third Reich.